You know, I've spent most of my life thinking about investments, about companies, about the fundamental value of things. But every once in a while, something happens in the world that reminds us that not everything can be measured in dollars and cents. Some things are measured in lives and principles, in the choices nations make when their people are attacked. And that's what we need to talk about today. Operation Hawkeye, America's response to the killing of 3 Americans in Syria, and what it tells us about the world we're living in right now. Just yesterday, the United States launched what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called a declaration of vengeance. Not the beginning of a war, mind you, but a very deliberate, very pointed response to an attack that took place on December 13th in the ancient city of Palmyra, Syria. 2 young soldiers from the Iowa National Guard, Sergeant William Nathaniel Howard, 29 years old, from Marshalltown, and Sergeant Edgar Torres-Tovar, 25, from Des Moines, along with their civilian interpreter, Ayad Sakat, were killed in what authorities describe as an ambush by a lone ISIS gunman. 3 other Iowa National Guardsmen were wounded. These weren't abstract casualties reported on a screen somewhere. These were real people with families, with futures, conducting what the Pentagon called the key leader engagement in support of ongoing counter-ISIS operations. They were doing their jobs, representing their country in one of the most complicated regions on earth, and they paid the ultimate price. Now, the American response was significant. More than 100 precision munitions hitting over 70 targets across central Syria, fighter jets, Apache attack helicopters, HIMARS rocket artillery, the full spectrum of American military capability brought to bear on ISIS infrastructure, weapons storage sites, and operational areas. They called it Operation Hawkeye, a reference to Iowa being known as the Hawkeye State. There's something deeply American about that, honoring the fallen by naming the operation after their home. It's personal, it's deliberate, and it sends a message that in the real world, every action has consequences. But here's where it gets interesting and where we need to think carefully about what's really happening. The immediate news tells us about airstrikes and retaliation, about justice being served. That's important, no question. But if we stop there, we're missing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is always more complex, more nuanced, and frankly, more important than the immediate headlines. History often teaches us more than immediate headlines. So let's take a step back and look at the chessboard, because that's really what we're dealing with here, a geopolitical chessboard where every piece matters and where the game has been going on for decades. Syria today is not the Syria of 5 years ago. And it's certainly not the Syria of a decade ago when ISIS was controlling vast territories and declaring a caliphate. The country just went through a seismic change. In December 2024, barely a year ago, the Assad regime, which had governed Syria since 1971, under Hafez al-Assad and then his son Bashar, starting in 2000, collapsed in a matter of days. An 11-day offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which itself has roots going back to al-Qaeda, before breaking away, swept through the country. Within less than 2 weeks, Assad was on a plane to Russia, given asylum and aid. New interim government was declared. For context, that's the kind of rapid change that reshapes everything. Power vacuums, security arrangements, who controls what territory, who has what weapons. When I look at major transitions in business, I always pay attention to the moments of maximum uncertainty, because that's when the risks are highest and when the most consequential decisions get made. Syria is living through that moment right now. The new Syrian government, led by President Ahmad al-Sharaa, is trying to build something functional out of the ruins of 53 years of Assad family rule. The United States, remarkably, has been engaging with this government, even though HTS was until recently designated as a terrorist organization. In July of this year, the U.S. actually removed that foreign terrorist designation, saying HTS had committed to combat terrorism. Sanctions have been progressively lifted. The goal, at least publicly, is to help Syria stabilize, rebuild, and become a functioning state that doesn't threaten its neighbors or serve as a haven for terrorist groups. That's the theory anyway. In practice, it's extraordinarily complicated. Syria is fractured along ethnic and religious lines. You've got Alawites who were closely associated with Assad, Druze communities in the south, Christians, Kurds in the northeast, and Sunni Arab majorities elsewhere. There have already been incidents of sectarian violence, with reports of massacres in Alawite coastal areas and violence against Druze communities. The country is still occupied in parts by Turkey-backed forces in the north, by Israel in the south. Israel actually expanded its presence in the Golan Heights and conducted extensive airstrikes to destroy Assad-era military capabilities. And you've got about 2,000 American troops, mostly in the northeast, working with Syrian democratic forces into this chaotic environment. You still have ISIS. Not the ISIS that once controlled Raqqa and Mosul, but what military analysts call ISIS remnants, somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 fighters operating as insurgents, conducting ambushes, trying to disrupt stabilization efforts, and testing whether the new Syrian government and its international partners can actually maintain security. The December 13th attack that killed the 3 Americans was exactly that kind of test. Here's where it gets murky, though, and this is important. According to Syria's Ministry of Interior Affairs, the gunman had actually been part of Syria's internal security service under the new government. ISIS hasn't even claimed responsibility for the attack. U.S. and Syrian officials acknowledge the ties to ISIS aren't entirely clear-cut. This is the fog of war, the ambiguity that defines so many conflicts in the Middle East. You're dealing with shifting loyalties, infiltration, individuals who might have multiple allegiances or who might be acting on their own initiative. It's not a clean battlefield with uniformed armies. It's insurgency, it's terrorism, it's opportunism. So when President Trump announced these strikes and said the U.S. was hitting ISIS strongholds with Syria's government fully in support, what he's really saying is that America is trying to work with the new Syrian leadership to eliminate a common threat. That's a significant shift. A year ago, we weren't coordinating with anyone in Damascus because Assad was still in charge and he was aligned with Russia and Iran. Now we're conducting strikes that the Syrian government publicly supports. The Jordanians, longtime American partners, joined in the operation. This is what military coordination looks like when you're trying to stabilize a country without putting tens of thousands of boots on the ground, which the America and public has absolutely no appetite for, and which frankly wouldn't solve the underlying problems anyway. Let's talk about what these strikes actually mean beyond the immediate tactical level. The Pentagon says the goal is to deliver a significant blow to ISIS remnants, to degrade their infrastructure, to eliminate weapons caches, to make it harder for them to operate. In the week following the December 13th attack and before the major strikes on Friday, U.S. partners conducted 10 operations with American support that resulted in the capture or killing of 23 ISIS militants. They gathered intelligence from electronics seized in these raids, which then informed the targeting for the larger strike operation. This is methodical, intelligence-driven counterterrorism. It's not indiscriminate. It's using information, surveillance, reconnaissance, and precision weapons to go after specific targets. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of U.S. Central Command, visited the American outposts where those Iowa National Guardsmen were based, recognized the troops for their actions under fire, and discussed the coming strikes. This is leadership staying connected to the operational level, making sure the response is both meaningful and proportional. But let's think about the larger strategic context, because that's where things get really interesting from a long-term perspective. America has been fighting ISIS in various forms for over a decade now. The organization declared its caliphate in 2014, and by 2019 it had been territorially defeated, losing its last strongholds in Syria and Iraq. But defeating a terrorist organization territorially doesn't mean you've eliminated the ideology or the capacity for violence. Al-Qaeda lost Afghanistan in 2001 and spent the next decade conducting operations from Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. ISIS has done something similar. It's metastasized. According to U.S. intelligence estimates, ISIS claimed double the number of attacks in Syria in 2024 compared to 2023. That's a worrying trend line. It suggests that in the chaos of Assad's fall and the establishment of a new government, ISIS saw an opportunity and tried to exploit it. From their perspective, this is the moment to reconstitute, to show they're still relevant, to attract new recruits who might be disillusioned with the new government or who might be driven by sectarian grievances. The American calculation is straightforward. We can't allow Syria to become a safe haven for terrorist organizations again. We saw what happened when Afghanistan under the Taliban provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda in the 1990s. September 11th was the direct result. We saw what happened when ISIS controlled territory in Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2017. They planned and inspired attacks around the world, from Paris to Brussels to San Bernardino. The cost of ignoring these threats is too high, so America keeps a military presence relatively small, mostly advising and assisting local partners, conducting strikes when necessary, gathering intelligence, and trying to prevent the kind of large-scale reconstitution that would threaten not just Syria, but Europe and potentially the United States. It's not glamorous. It doesn't generate headlines most days, and it requires patience. Lots of patience. Patience and perspective are key to understanding any major decision. Now, let's consider the human element here, because that matters enormously. Those two soldiers from Iowa, they were National Guardsmen, not active duty military. That means they had lives back home, probably jobs, definitely families and communities in Des Moines and Marshalltown. They got deployed to Syria, which is about as far from Iowa as you can imagine, both geographically and culturally. And they were there doing the unglamorous work of counterterrorism, building relationships with local partners, conducting what the military calls key leader engagements, trying to gather intelligence and maintain security. It's dangerous work, it's important work, and it often goes unrecognized until something goes tragically wrong. President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth attended the dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base earlier this week, honoring these fallen Americans. That's significant. It's the commander-in-chief and the defense secretary taking the time to receive the remains, to show respect, to acknowledge the sacrifice. It tells the military and the country that these lives mattered, that their service meant something. But here's the harder question. What does their sacrifice actually achieve? If we're being honest, that's a question without a simple answer. In the immediate term, Operation Hawkeye struck ISIS targets, probably killed some fighters, certainly destroyed some infrastructure and weapons. It sent a message that attacking Americans carries severe consequences. That message matters, both for deterrence, making others think twice before attacking U.S. forces, and for reassuring allies that America stands by its commitments. Jordan participated in these strikes because they trust that when they work with America, America will respond decisively when things go wrong. That trust is the foundation of all our partnerships in the region. But in the longer term, does striking ISIS infrastructure fundamentally change the trajectory of Syria or the threat from terrorism? Probably not. ISIS is an ideology as much as it's an organization. You can destroy every building, every weapons cache, every training camp. And if the underlying conditions that allow extremism to flourish remain, poverty, lack of opportunity, sectarian grievances, weak governance, and new recruits will emerge, new cells will form, and the cycle continues. This isn't pessimism, it's realism based on decades of experience fighting these kinds of organizations. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their various offshoots have proven remarkably resilient precisely because they're not traditional military organizations with hierarchies and fixed positions. They're networks, they're adaptable, and they're willing to wait years or decades to achieve their objectives. So what's the alternative? Do we just leave and let Syria sort itself out? That's tempting, and there's definitely a strain of American political thought that says exactly that. We've spent too much blood and treasure in the Middle East. We need to focus on challenges closer to home or on great power competition with China. President Trump himself, before taking office in his second term, said Syria was not our fight. And you know, there's something to that argument. America can't be the world's policeman, can't solve every problem, can't rebuild every broken country. We have limited resources, limited attention, and our own challenges to deal with. The decision to have U.S. troop numbers in Syria, bringing them down to around 1,000, reflects that thinking. We're staying engaged, but with a lighter footprint, relying more on partners and less on large American deployments. But here's the counter-argument, and it's one I think carries considerable weight. The world is interconnected in ways it's never been before. A terrorist attack planned in Syria can kill people in Paris, London, or New York. The refugee crisis that Syria generated, 6.8 million Syrians fled abroad, about a third of the population, destabilized Europe, contributed to political upheaval, and changed the course of multiple elections. The spillover from Syria's civil war affected Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. Why? Can't neatly contain these problems within borders. So even if Syria isn't our fight in the sense of our territory or our direct national survival being at stake, It touches on our interest in maintaining regional stability, preventing terrorism, supporting allies, and upholding international norms against the use of chemical weapons and mass atrocities. These interests might be indirect, but they're real. The economic angle here is also worth considering. Syria's economy is devastated. Years of war, corruption under Assad, sanctions, and infrastructure destruction have left the country dependent on international assistance. The lifting of sanctions by the US, UK, and EU is meant to encourage investment, particularly from Arab Gulf states, in Syrian reconstruction. Estimates put the cost of rebuilding Syria at hundreds of billions of dollars. That's a massive number, and it's not clear where it's going to come from. But if Syria can't rebuild, if people can't find jobs, if basic services don't function, then you perpetuate exactly the conditions that allow groups like ISIS to recruit. Young men without opportunities, without hope, are vulnerable to radical ideologies that offer meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging, even if that ideology is violent and destructive. Breaking that cycle requires economic development, which requires investment, which requires stability and security. It's all connected. Now, from an investor's perspective, and I've spent my whole life thinking about how to allocate capital wisely, Syria is about as risky as it gets. You've got political instability. You've got sectarian violence. You've got foreign military interventions from multiple countries. You've got an unproven government trying to establish legitimacy. You've got the risk of ISIS resurgence. And you've got sanctions that, even though being lifted, could be reimposed if Thai NGS goes sideways. No rational investor would put significant capital into Syria today without massive risk premiums. But governments and international organizations aren't motivated purely by profit. They're thinking about humanitarian needs, about preventing state failure, about not allowing another Libya or Yemen situation where state collapse creates chaos that spreads far beyond the country's borders. So there will be money flowing into Syria, but it'll be aid money, development money, and very cautious private investment focused on basic necessities, food, energy, construction materials. Let's talk about the relationship between America and Syria's new government, because this is fascinating and historically unusual. HTS, the group now leading Syria, has jihadist origins. It grew out of the al-Nusra Front, which was al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. That's not ancient history. We're talking about the 2010s. At various points, HTS fought against the Assad regime, against ISIS, against Turkish-backed rebels, and against Kurdish forces. It's governed Idlib province for years and apparently did a decent job providing basic services and maintaining order, which is part of why it has legitimacy among some Syrians, but it's still viewed with deep suspicion by many Christians, Alawites, Druze, secularists, women's rights advocates, all of whom worry that HTS will impose strict Islamic rule. So far, HTS and its leader, Ahmad al-Sharaa, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, have said the right things. They promised inclusive government, protection for minorities, women's rights, and a transition to civilian rule. They've appointed a cabinet. They've issued a constitutional declaration. They've even held indirect parliamentary elections. The U.S. decision to remove the terrorist designation and engage with this government suggests that American policymakers believe HTS has changed, or at least is moving in the right direction. But trust takes time to build, and it can be destroyed in an instant. If HTS starts persecuting minorities, if they fail to prevent sectarian violence, if they provide haven to extremist groups, then all the engagement and sanctions relief could be reversed very quickly. The coordination on Operation Hawkeye is a test case. The Syrian government publicly supported American strikes against ISIS on Syrian territory. That's significant cooperation. It shows alignment of interests. Both Syria and the U.S. want ISIS gone, but it also means the Syrian government is dependent on American military power to address threats it can't handle itself. The Syrian army was decimated during the civil war and the final offensive against Assad. Most soldiers deserted, equipment was destroyed or captured, and the country's military capability is a fraction of what it once was. Israel's strikes in the immediate aftermath of Assad's fall destroyed an estimated 70 to 80% of Syria's remaining military capacity, including most of its air defense systems. So Syria can't defend its own airspace, can't conduct large-scale military operations against ISIS, and relies on a patchwork of militias, local forces, and international partners. That vulnerability is both a risk and an opportunity. A risk because any number of actors could exploit it, and an opportunity because it creates dependence on international support, which gives the U.S. and others leverage to shape Syria's future direction. Let's consider the regional dynamics because Syria doesn't exist in isolation. Turkey is deeply involved, both politically and militarily. Turkey has troops in northern Syria, backs the Syrian National Army, which controls areas near the Turkish border and has been fighting Kurdish forces it considers linked to the PKK, a designated terrorist group in Turkey. Turkey views a strong Kurdish autonomous region in northeastern Syria as an existential threat because it could inspire Kurdish separatism within Turkey itself, where Kurds are a significant minority. So Turkey supported the overthrow of Assad, partly to weaken Iran and Russia, Assad's backers, but also to ensure that Kurdish autonomy doesn't become permanent. The Syrian Democratic Forces, which the U.S. works with and which played a crucial role in defeating ISIS's territorial caliphate, are predominantly Kurdish and hold thousands of ISIS fighters in detention. If Turkey and Turkish-backed forces push too hard against the SDF, those detention facilities could be overwhelmed and thousands of ISIS fighters could escape. That's a nightmare scenario. Israel has its own calculations. Israel occupied the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967 and formally annexed it in 1981, though that annexation isn't recognized internationally. After Assad fell, Israel expanded its military presence beyond the Golan into what had been a UN buffer zone, destroyed Syrian military assets to prevent them from falling into hands Israel considers hostile, and has made clear it won't tolerate any threat from Syrian territory. Prime Minister Netanyahu actually said Assad's fall was a result of Israeli strikes against Iran and Hezbollah, Assad's key backers, which weakened the regime to the point of collapse. There's some truth to that. Hezbollah suffered significant losses in its conflict with Israel in 2024, and Iran has been dealing with economic sanctions, internal unrest, and the strain of supporting multiple proxy groups across the region. With Assad gone and a new government in Damascus, Israel is both hopeful and wary. Hopeful that Syria might become less hostile, maybe even normalize relations eventually, but wary that instability could spill over the border or that extremist groups could gain ground near Israeli territory. Iran, meanwhile, has lost its key Arab ally. Syria under Assad was crucial to Iran's strategy of maintaining influence from Tehran to Beirut, providing a land bridge to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon and projecting power in the region. With Assad gone, that access is cut off. Iran is diplomatically isolated, economically strained, and watching its regional influence diminish. That's strategically significant for the United States, for Israel, and for Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE that view Iran as their primary adversary. A weaker Iran is, from their perspective, a positive development. But it also means Iran might be more desperate, more willing to take risks, more likely to lash out through its remaining proxies or even directly. Russia, Assad's other major backer, is in a difficult position. Russia has military bases in Syria, a naval facility at Tartus, and an air base at Himyim, which are strategically valuable because they provide Russia's only Mediterranean ports and projection points. Russia's intervention in 2015 turned the tide of the Syrian civil war in Assad's favor and prevented his government from falling then. But Russia is now fully committed to its war in Ukraine, which is consuming vast military resources and attention. Russia negotiated with the new Syrian government to maintain its bases, but it's unclear how sustainable that arrangement is or whether Russia will retain the influence it once had. Putin invested heavily in Assad, and Assad's fall represents a geopolitical setback for Russia, even if they manage to extract him safely and preserve some military presence. All of these regional dynamics, Turkish concerns about Kurds, Israeli security imperatives, Iranian loss of influence, Russian retrenchment, Arab Gulf states' interest in reconstruction and stability, create an incredibly complex environment. The United States is trying to balance all of these interests while pursuing its own goals, defeating ISIS, preventing terrorism, supporting Israeli security, maintaining alliances with Turkey and Jordan, and avoiding another massive Middle Eastern quagmire that consumes American lives and resources for decades. It's diplomatic and military chess at the highest level, and frankly, there are no perfect moves. Every decision involves trade-offs, risks, and unintended consequences. So where does Operation Hawkeye fit into all of this? It's a statement of American resolve and capability. It's a message to ISIS that the U.S. will respond to attacks on American forces with overwhelming force. It's reassurance to allies that America honors its commitments and protects its people. It's coordination with Syria's new government to build a working relationship and align against common threats. But it's also a recognition that the underlying problems in Syria, sectarianism, economic devastation, weak governance, foreign interventions, aren't going to be solved by airstrikes. Military force is necessary but insufficient. You need diplomacy, you need economic development, you need political reconciliation, and you need time, lots of time. I've been investing for over 70 years, and one thing I've learned is that the best investments are the ones you make when you understand the fundamentals, when you have a long-term perspective, and when you're not swayed by short-term volatility. The same principle applies to foreign policy, even though governments often struggle with it because political timelines are short, election cycles, budget years, media attention spans. But the reality is that generational problems require generational solutions. Syria has been broken for 14 years of civil war, and before that, it was under authoritarian rule that prevented real development. ENT of civil society, independent institutions, and rule of law. You don't fix that in a year or even 5 years. You fix it if you're lucky and smart and work hard over decades. The 3 Americans who died in Palmyra, Howard, Torres-Tovar, and Sakat, were part of that long-term effort. They weren't fighting a conventional war with front lines and decisive battles. They were doing the patient, difficult work of counterterrorism, building relationships, gathering intelligence, and trying to create enough stability that local forces can eventually handle security themselves. It's frustrating work because progress is slow and reversible. You can train a unit, conduct an operation, eliminate some threats, and then 6 months later, the same problems re-emerge in slightly different form. But the alternative, complete withdrawal, letting Syria become a failed state, allowing terrorist groups to operate freely, is worse. We learned that lesson in the 1990s with Afghanistan, and we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Here's what I think about when I look at Operation Hawkeye and the broader situation in Syria. We're at an inflection point. Syria just underwent regime change. There's a new government that the international community is cautiously engaging with. Sanctions are being lifted, refugees are starting to return, diplomatic relations are being restored. This is the best opportunity in over a decade to put Syria on a better path. But it's also a moment of maximum vulnerability. ISIS is trying to disrupt the transition. Sectarian tensions are high, the economy is in ruins, and multiple foreign powers are maneuvering for advantage. How the next year or two unfolds will determine Syria's trajectory for a generation. The American role in that is important but limited. We can conduct strikes like Operation Hawkeye to prevent ISIS from reconstituting. We can provide intelligence and training to local forces. We can use diplomatic pressure to encourage inclusive governance and protection of minorities. We can support reconstruction efforts through organizations like the World Bank and encourage Gulf states to invest. But we can't impose a solution from the outside. Syrians have to decide what kind of country they want to build, and that process will be messy, contested, and uncertain. Different groups have different visions: secular versus religious, centralized versus federal, aligned with the West versus non-aligned. All of those debates have to be worked out politically, and there's no guarantee they'll be resolved peacefully. From an American perspective, I think the strategy of maintaining a relatively small military presence, working with partners, conducting strikes when necessary, and supporting diplomatic and economic efforts makes sense given our interests and constraints. We're not trying to occupy Syria or remake it in our image. We're trying to prevent it from becoming a source of international terrorism and regional instability. That's a more modest goal, but it's achievable if we're patient and consistent. The bigger risk is that we oscillate, commit heavily, get frustrated, withdraw completely, and then have to come back when things fall apart. That cycle is expensive, demoralizing, and ineffective. One more thing I want to touch on is the economic cost of all this. The United States spends hundreds of billions of dollars annually on defense, and a portion of that goes to operations in Syria and the broader Middle East. Those F-15 seconds, Apache helicopters, HIMARS systems, precision munitions, they're expensive. Training soldiers, deploying them overseas, providing support and logistics, it all adds up. Some people look at those numbers and say, we can't afford it. We should bring everyone home and focus on domestic priority. Yes, I understand that sentiment. America has plenty of needs here at home, infrastructure, education, healthcare, but the reality is that we live in a world where threats can emerge anywhere and affect us here. September 11th cost nearly 3,000 lives and had enormous economic impacts. Preventing another attack like that is worth significant investment. The question isn't whether we should spend money on defense and counterterrorism. It's whether we're spending it wisely, whether we're achieving our objectives, and whether the strategy is sustainable. I think reasonable people can disagree about the right level of engagement in Syria, but I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that we should completely ignore ISIS or pretend that what happens in Syria doesn't affect American interests. The interconnected nature of the modern world means that instability anywhere can have ripple effects everywhere through terrorism, refugee flows, economic disruptions, and shifts in great power competition. China and Russia are watching how America handles Syria. Our allies are watching. Our adversaries are watching. The decisions we make send signals about our reliability, our resolve, and our willingness to sustain commitments over time. Operation Hawkeye, in that light, is much more than just a retaliatory strike. It's a statement about American values, that we honor those who serve, that we protect our people, that we hold those who attack us accountable. It's a strategic message that we remain engaged in the Middle East even as we adjust our posture and reduce our footprint. It's coordination with a new Syrian government that we're cautiously working with to build something better out of the ruins of the Assad era. And it's a reminder that defeating groups like ISIS requires persistence, patience, and a long-term commitment that extends beyond any single administration or political cycle. If there's one thing I'd want people to take away from all of this, it's the importance of perspective. The news cycle moves fast. Today's headlines are tomorrow's forgotten stories. But the underlying dynamics in places like Syria move slowly, changing a country's trajectory, building stable institutions, defeating entrenched ideologies. These things take time, measured in years and decades, not days or weeks. When we look at events like Operation Hawkeye, we need to see them not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a much larger puzzle. Every piece matters. Every decision has consequences that ripple forward in time. Those 3 Americans who died in Palmyra, their sacrifice was real, their service was meaningful, and the response in their name sends a message that will echo across the region. Whether that message ultimately contributes to a more stable, peaceful Syria depends on countless other factors, many beyond American control. But the principle remains: when Americans are attacked, America responds. When our interests are threatened, we defend them. When our allies need support, we provide it. That consistency, that reliability, that willingness to back up our commitments with action when necessary, those are the things that maintain American influence and credibility in a dangerous world. So as we watch events in Syria continue to unfold, as we see whether the new government can establish itself, whether sectarian tensions can be managed, whether economic reconstruction can begin, whether ISIS can be truly defeated, let's remember that these are long-term challenges without quick fixes. Let's honor those who serve by understanding the complexity of what they're dealing with and by supporting strategies that give them the best chance of success. And let's recognize that in a world of uncertainty and change, the fundamentals still matter: strength, backed by restraint, engagement balanced with realism, and the patience to see difficult endeavors through to completion. That's how you build lasting value, whether in business or in the challenging work of international security. And that ultimately is what Operation Hawkeye represents: America making a difficult choice at a critical moment in pursuit of objectives that matter for our security and the stability of a region that's been in turmoil for far too long.